Aloha and welcome to Module 8 on conditional expressions and branching. And we're going to learn how to conditionally execute statements and use that to create algorithms that have logical conditions. In this module you'll see there's some readings on branching and this screencast and Lab 4. And some practice WODs on Day of the Week and Invoice 2, which will incorporate some conditional statements. Okay, so let's go take a look at the slides for today. You're probably going to want to have NetBeans open and maybe make a project called Lab 4 or something like that so that we can try out some of the stuff. When we talk about flow of control, we're really talking about if and switch statements. So what is flow of control? Flow of control is that normally when a program executes, and PHP is not unique to this, other programming languages are the same thing, that it just tends to flow from statement to statement that goes from top to bottom and left to right, more or less. Especially the top to bottom, meaning that there's the first statement, the second statement, the third statement has to do with which comes before. And now in PHP, statements are designated by semicolons. So the flow of control really is that statements are executed, are read up to a semicolon, then executed, and it reads up to the next semicolon, and then executed, and then reads up to the next semicolon, and then executed in that order. So sometimes it's very useful to interrupt that normal flow of control. That instead of going semicolon, 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 there's two different things we might do to change that flow. One is we might get to a statement and say, well, do I want to execute this statement or not? And I might ask a question that if something is true, or if a certain condition holds, then you should execute. Or if a certain condition doesn't hold, you should skip it. So you can interrupt the flow of control by selection, they call it, by either skipping or jumping over a statement or multiple statements. The other thing you could do is when you get to a certain statement, instead of going on to the next statement, you could repeat that same statement. So you could continue repeating one statement over and over and over again until a certain condition holds true or false. And that's what we call a loop. So one is called selection, which is a kind of a branch. Actually, both of these are branching. Selection, which is just skipping a statement or not, and then repetition, which is repeating the same thing, or a loop. Now, to operate, to do these things, we need to understand the data type Boolean a little bit better. So generally what we want to do is we will execute a statement conditionally. Conditioned on what? Well, whether something is true or false. So the type Boolean allows us to represent whether a condition is in the state of true or false. So it has a value. It only has two values, true and false. It's not really 0 and 1 like some people tend to think about, or something like that. Those are sort of equivalents to things, but literally the value is true or the value is false. Notice that there's no quotes here. There's no quotes on true or false. So it's not the letters TRUE and the letters FALSE. It's literally a value called true and false. Every expression is Boolean in some way, in that there's equivalents to what we call true or false Booleans, like the value 0, or the integer 0, corresponds to false, and 0.0 and the quote 0 and empty string are all considered the equivalent in value to false. Things that are non-empty strings, or an integer that's not 0 and things like that, are going to be considered true. So comparison operators like greater than and less than and things like that, or equals equals, are operators that always evaluate to a Boolean. So they're called Boolean operators or Boolean expressions because they always become either true or false after it's evaluated. So let's take an example. So I might have a variable called $grade, and whatever's in there, I might ask if it's equivalent to or equal to the letter A, or capital letter A. If it turns out that what's the value of this is equivalent in value to A, then this Boolean expression becomes true, and then I can assign that to isDesiredGrade. So the isDesiredGrade will be a Boolean variable being only true or false. Similarly, I might have something like age greater than or equal to 21 to check to see maybe somebody's ID or something like that. They're over 21 so they can purchase alcohol or something like that. The drinking age being 21, again, this will either return true or false. Either age is greater than or equal to 21 or it's not. If it is, it returns true. Then I assign that to drinking age, or it's false. And here's another one, something like not equal. So we can also ask negation things like, is year not equal to the quote senior? So if this string is not equivalent to the string value in here, and it doesn't have the same letters, this is going to return true. And if it is different, then it's going to return false. Actually, if it is true, if it's senior, it returns false, and if it's not, it returns true. So it's just the opposite. By the way, that's the equivalent. You could also do this. You could put a not here, and this would be the logical equivalent. Say if it is the senior, then it becomes false, and if it is not the senior, it becomes true. Exactly the same expression. So some of these Boolean expressions are equivalent. So Boolean expressions are thought of as sort of test conditions. They ask questions, and the answer is always true, yes, or false, no. So you might always ask the question, you might need to know whether something like, is A greater than B? Is a value A greater than a value B? Or is it less than or equal to B? And you just have to translate that into the proper expression, like less than, greater than, less than or equal to. Equals is equivalent. Now this special one is equals. This means not just identical, not just equal in value, but also equal in data type. So as we mentioned before, you might have something that like the number 0 is equivalent to the Boolean false, but it's not, it's an integer, so it's not the same as the Boolean data type false. So if you said 0 equals false, that would return true. And if you said 0 equals then it would not be. And then you have not equals, and this should not be there. There should be a comma there. Not equals, and then not identically equals, and there's other things like that too. If you do a comparison operator of things that aren't numbers, then it does a lexicographic comparison, like, A comes before B, so A would be less than B. If you have to be careful when you're comparing different data types, because you have to make sure that they convert to things that make sense. Sometimes they don't. Let's take a look at that, for example. Let's take a look. Let's go to NetBeans here, and let's create a new project. And we'll create, let's just call this Lab 4. Okay. And make sure I set this to NetBeans adapter, and I'm just going to do this. I'm going to do a var dump var underscore dump, and I'm going to say 0 equals false, and let's see what it returns. Okay, you can see that it returned Boolean true. Now, maybe that seems a little odd to you, but if you look carefully, you'll see that that's pretty much exactly what you expected. So let's take a look here at that. Oops, let me make that a little better. Okay, there. So we said, does the value integer 0 equal in value the Boolean value false? Notice again, no quotes, and that is true because they are equivalent. Now watch what happens if I put 3 equal signs there, put 3 equal signs there, and refresh that, and you see it says Boolean false. Now 0 equals 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 false is false because this is an integer and that's a Boolean. And so while value they're equal, they are not equal in data type. So we call that identically equal. So sometimes that's necessary or useful. The basic comparison operators that generate Boolean expressions are listed here. So if you need like the greater than or equal sign, use this greater than and then equal right afterwards. And here are some examples. When you want to print Boolean values, you have to be careful, because if you echo a Boolean value or print a Boolean value, it's going to first convert it to a string, and then it's going to print it out. So it has to say what's the Boolean equivalent of true, or the string equivalent of true. It's going to be 1, and echo is no output. Let's take a look at that just to show. This is a very common mistake that people make. This is why I used var dump here instead of echo or print. So let's just say I say echo true, and I run that, and you see it says 1. And then if I say echo false and I run that, I get blank, nothing here. Okay, and that's not because nothing's printing out. It's just that this is converting to a string, and the string equivalent for false is the empty string, and the string equivalent for true is the number 1, or the letter 1, I should say. Let's make that Chrome. Okay, going back here. Once again, the identical comparison operator will not only check to see if it's in value, it'll also see if it's the same data type. And the two identical ones are like equals 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 and not equals equals. So you can see, for example, 0.0 does equal in value 0, but it does not equal equal equal. It's not identically equal. Now you can take these Boolean expressions and you can add them together by using logical operators and here and or. And this is exactly what you remember from maybe your math class or something like that. It just says that if something is true and true, then that means it evaluates to true. Something that's true and false would be false, and false and true would be false. So in other words, both things have to be true for it to be true. Whereas with an or, any one of them has to be true for the whole thing to be true. For convenience, they have different ways. You could use the word or you can use this thing called double pipe or bar. Same for and, you could use and. And in this way, you can connect things together, like B is equals 0, or A is less than or equal to B, and B is less than or equal to C. You have to be careful about where you put the parentheses, because remember precedence. Who's going to have higher precedence? These logical operators have very low precedence, and this has equals has a little higher precedence. So you put things down in parentheses based on what you want done first, also to make it easy to understand. There is a way to, when you do a double and or a single and, it actually, a double and like this, it always evaluates everything here. But except for the fact that if you notice that if you have something like B equals 0 or A less than B and B is less than C, well, you only need this side or this side to be true before the whole thing is going to be true. So PHP is smart enough to know that if this is true, right, then it doesn't need to look at the rest of this stuff, because the whole thing is going to be true. As long as one of them is true, then the whole thing is true. In that case, these things don't get evaluated. Similarly, for this thing to be true, both of these guys need to be true. So if any one of if this one is false or that one is false, it doesn't need to evaluate both of them. So it'll just return false as soon as the first one is false. Sometimes that's not useful. Sometimes you're going to want to don't want to short circuit this. This is what's called short circuiting, meaning that you sort of take a shortcut and you want everything to evaluate, because sometimes you actually have things do work. I'll talk a little bit more about that in class, but you can force that to happen by using just a single pipe or a single AND. The truth tables for Boolean operators and, or, and not are given here. So you can see that it's, again, and means that both things have to be true for it to be true, or just any one of them. Not just flips things around. Again, look at where the precedence rules for. Notice that the comparison operators fall below the arithmetic operators. Okay, so they have lower precedence. So you can do your arithmetic stuff first, then do your comparisons without having to do parentheses. But notice that even lower are the compound operators, or the logical operators that combine things, the ands and the ors. So now that brings us to our first use of conditional expressions, and that we'll use the conditional expressions to change the flow of control by using a new kind of construct we haven't talked about called the if statement. There's also equivalent kinds of things called the if else, else, and an if else, and then there's a switch. These are all variations of the same sort of thing. So what the if statement does is allow you to conditionally skip a statement based on whether the condition is true or false. Similarly, we'll have branching, another kind of branching called repetition, which will make loops, and we'll have the while, do while, for each, and for each. Now, these are not functions, just to let you know. These are actually built-in things to the language that checks whether, change the flow of control if something is true or while something is true. So that takes a little getting used to. In other words, you wouldn't end it with a semicolon because it's not going to be a statement. So let's look at the PHP if statement. So it's used to make very simple decision. The decision is simply that if something is true, then execute the statement. If it's not true or false, then don't execute it. So the syntax looks like this: if, parenthesis, a Boolean expression that returns true or false, or gets converted to a true or false. Don't forget that can happen too. If that happens, then up to the semicolon here is going to be executed. If it's false, then everything up to the semicolon is skipped. Anything that comes after that semicolon is always executed. We indent these things to make things more readable. So here's an example. Let's just say that we want to see whether we have the number of eggs in our basket is less than a dozen. So we could ask the question, is the value in the variable $eggs per basket less than 12? Okay, and if it is, this is going to be true. And then this next statement here, this is not a statement, that's just a comment. The next statement is echo less than a dozen eggs per basket, and semicolon. So this statement will be executed because if this is true, and if this is false, this statement is skipped. No matter what happens, this statement afterwards, total eggs equals no number of eggs times eggs per basket, and then this one are going to be executed. Let's try it out. It's easier to see than it is to talk about. So I'm going to copy that. I'm going to paste it over here. I'm going to reformat to make it look nice. And you'll notice that you see how it's indented here. It says if and then the echo. It's not necessary to indent it, but this makes it easier for us to read. So by convention, anything that's under the control of an if statement will be indented, meaning that this statement is the thing that's going to be conditionally executed, whether this is true or not. Okay, so to get this to work, we're going to need to make a $eggs per basket. And let's say the eggs per basket is 10. Okay, if we set eggs per basket for 10, and we run this, we say less than a dozen eggs per basket. We have a total of 0 eggs. Notice that I forgot to put a new line in there, so let's put a BR here to make that look nice. There. Okay. You have a total of 0 eggs. Oh, maybe you should probably make total eggs here. Number of eggs. So we have less than a dozen eggs per basket. You have a total of 30 eggs. Okay. Now if I change this here to say 13, actually let's just make it 12. Well, make it 13. Make it 13, that's this thing, 13 less than 12. No, that's false, so this statement won't execute. So it should just calculate this and print out eggs per basket. And sure enough, it just says a total of 39 eggs. Notice also if I put 12, well, 12 is less than 12. That's false because it's not less than or equal to. It's strictly less than. So this also will give me, will not say that I have number of eggs per basket is less. It is possible to execute. Now notice that right now, this conditional expression, so a common mistake that people make is they put a semicolon here. You don't want to put a semicolon there. Let's go take a look and see what happens if you put a semicolon there. So let's just say I put eggs per basket. Let's go back to 10. Okay, and we run this here. And you see that it says less than a dozen eggs per basket. Now what happens if I put a semicolon here? If I put a semicolon here, you notice that it looked like it worked. It prints the same thing. But now what happens if I change eggs per basket to 13? Now if I change eggs per basket to 13, that should not print less than a dozen eggs. But notice when I run it, it still prints less than a dozen eggs. So in other words, it's no longer working. Take this semicolon out, it now works. Put the semicolon back in, not working. So what's going on here? Again, this if is not a statement in its own right. It says that it's a conditional. It says that when this is true, then execute up to the next semicolon. So if I have a semicolon here, it says, okay, if this is true, then execute up to the semicolon, but there's nothing here, so it does nothing. If this is false, it skips it, so it does nothing. In either case, what happens is this next statement gets executed because it's not under the control of this anymore. In fact, watch what happens if I do a source format. See how the echo came back over here? It's no longer indented. That's because it knows to indent it up to the semicolon. Okay, so if I go back, so a very common mistake is to accidentally put a semicolon after that. The actual expression goes all the way, the conditional statement is starting with this, that's the conditional, and goes all the way to the first semicolon, which is there. It turns out that if you need to do more than one statement, you can put curly braces in here. That's called a block. And we'll get to that in a minute. Here, I'll do a source format like that. Make that look nicer. And this is exactly identical. It says that if this is true, then execute everything in between the curly braces. See? And so I can make that now 11 and see how it works just fine. So when you put curly braces in things, they call that a compound statement. And when you put the curly braces, if you take a lot of statements, again, a statement is anything ending with a semicolon, and you put them between curly braces, that's called a block. It's a code block. And so it just says, again, executing everything here as a block. And you gotta ask, well, why would you want to do that? Well, sometimes you need to execute more than one statement. So, for example, I might want to say not just less than a dozen eggs per basket, but then maybe I increase the cost of the price per basket because I'm taking less than a dozen eggs. So, how would I do that? I could copy this here like this. Let's just copy this. Copying that, going back over here. Okay, so what happens is now I have my curly brace. If I have less than 12, I'm going to say less than a dozen eggs per basket, and I'm going to increase by 10% the cost per basket. So I'm going to do two things, and you see there that I have less than a dozen eggs per basket. I have a total of 33 eggs. The cost per basket, I can put like maybe an echo quote BR. Cost is $, cost per basket. There. Oops. cost per basket $2.12, but notice that it's 10% more if I have less than a dozen eggs, and if I go more than a dozen eggs, it's now the regular price. Okay, so again, you might need to do multiple things. If you have a whole lot of statements that you need to conditionally execute, sometimes making the curly braces control block gets confusing, especially in large blocks of HTML. So alternatively, you can put this colon and then end if in there. It's exactly the same thing. It just makes it sometimes a little more readable. So I could put colon and then I say end if like that, and now it's exactly the same conditional expression. There, you see, same thing. There. Now that was a simple conditional. Sometimes we need to do more complex conditionals where we have to not just skip or execute based on whether something is true or false. Maybe we only want to do one or the other thing, but at least one of them is done. So the way we handle that is we do the if-else statement. I'm going to show you what I'm talking about here. Let's just say we have a statement that, let's say, if time is less than limit, you made it, else echo, you missed the deadline. So say we're doing a WOD or something like that. We want to see if our time works for whether we made our time statement. So let's just make this new one here. It says if time is less than limit. So let's say time equals 10 and limit equals 15 minutes, and if we run this here, you see you made it. And let's just say I took 16 minutes, you missed the deadline. Okay. So notice that what happens is that it says that no matter what, it's not printing both. It's only going to print you made it or you missed the deadline. It's only one of these two alternatives. It's if it's this, do this, otherwise do that. If I didn't have the else here, so I take the else out, I'll put a comment here. If I take the else out, notice what happens is that it says I missed the deadline, but if I go back and I made the deadline, it's going to end up printing both. See how it printed both? So the else allows it to selectively choose one or the other. It's actually the same thing as doing if $time is greater than or equal to $limit. So what's happening here is, see that this conditional is the exact opposite of this. And so now it says you made it, and I say 17, and it says you missed the deadline. It's exactly the same as the if-else. Another way to look at that, see that it's the exact opposite, is you could put the exclamation in front, like this. Oops. So if I say this is not that, it would be the exact opposite. Once again, I get, oops, you missed the deadline. This has to be put into parentheses like that. Okay, put that like that. It says you missed the deadline, and now you can see if I go back to 10, you made the deadline. So you can see, again, putting a not does the exact opposite. It's kind of hard to read. But more simply, if else. And again, this is actually has some efficiency things which I'll discuss in class a little later. Notice that you can certainly put curly braces around things to make compound statements if you need to execute more than one statement, whether it's if or else. Again, you just put curly things by. So if it's the time is less than limit, do both of those things, else do both of those things. But only one block is executed, not both. This can be extended by using the if, else if, else if, else command. So let's take a look at this. So you can keep going and look at one of any alternatives. Let's copy this, and let's just use this to create grades. So let's just say that I take an exam and I have a score that's equal to 99, and I want to know what grade I get. So I'll say print your grade is $grade. Okay. Oops, I forgot my PHP. There. Let's refactor that, make that look nice. Notice that, so I have if, so I have score is 99, if score is greater than 90, and score is less than or equal to 100. So in other words, if the score is between 90 and 100, then my grade is A. Else if, meaning that if this is not true, it's going to check this. And if this is not true, it's going to check that. If this is not true, it's going to check that. Otherwise, if none of these things are true, it's going to give that, do that. So only one of these statements gets executed. As soon as one of these things is true, it stops checking and goes to the next statement, which is print your grade is that. So let's see if this works. My grade is an A. And let's say if I go down to an 80, 83, my grade is a B. If I go down to a 73, my grade is a C. And let's say if I get, 53, my grade is E. You see how that works? So it's only one of those alternatives. If, else if, else if, else if. But again, once one of these things is true, all the other ones are skipped. And there's an efficiency thing that you want to take into account here that we'll talk about in class. Another thing, let's take this example here. Let's take a look at this. If I say, let's take if, else if, else if, else if this, you have to be careful about how you set up the logic of things. One of the things I always ask in class is like, what happens if I reverse this sequence of things? We'll talk about that in class, but let's take a look at what happens if I try to use else if with equals. It says if professional relationship equals colleague, then the greeting is Thomas. If it's friend, then it's Tom, grad student, TC, professional, etc., etc. So notice it's going to check to see what relationship I have, and then it's going to change the greeting. So let's just say that I'm a grad student. So my professional relationship equals colleague is false, so this doesn't get executed. Then it says, is it friend? No, so that doesn't get executed. Professional relationship equals grad student. That's true, so the greeting is now going to be TC. This does not get executed, doesn't even get checked. That doesn't get executed, and the result is that greeting is TC. And the question is, if I took this out like this is exactly the same thing, except I don't actually need all these else ifs, right? Because only one of these things can be true. So this would be identically equal. But in this case, it's different because all of these would be checked. It would always check yes, 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 or no. So in this case, it's less efficient to write your code this way because it would have to check all of these statements regardless of whether they're true or false. Whereas in this case, as soon as one of these things is true, the rest of them are not going to be checked. And you can see for efficiency purposes, for large numbers of things, that's a good way to go. You can also use the switch statement. The switch statement is sort of the ultimate if condition that's much more general. And the switch statement says that based on the value here, it says switch on this value, check to see if that value is equal to colleague. If it's colleague, then execute this up until I get a break. If it doesn't get a break, it just follows through and keeps executing. Break means stop executing and go down to the end of the switch statement. So this is sort of the same thing as this. This switch statement is the same thing as this. And we'll talk more about that in class. Okay, so I hope that you've enjoyed this, and we'll work on the lab and give some elaborations of the stuff in class. See you there.